What happens when a single moment threatens everything you've built? What if temptation strikes right in your own home? For Maria and Jack, everything changed the day. They were left alone together when temptation nearly tore apart their family. Maria, recently married to Jack, thought she had it all, a fresh start in life with a new husband and a stepson, Ethan. But when Jack leaves for a business trip, Maria and Ethan are left alone. What starts as a simple afternoon together quickly spirals into something neither of them ever expected. This is the story of a moment of temptation, a deep emotional conflict, and the boundaries that hold a family together. Maria, at 42 years old, thought she had everything figured out. After years of being single, she had finally found someone she could truly love. Jack, her new husband, was everything she had hoped for. Kind, supportive, and someone who truly understood her. Their marriage was still new, but Maria had already started to feel at home in the life they were building together. But there was one challenge that was proving to be more difficult than she had anticipated: Jack's son, Ethan. Ethan wasn't a child. He was 23, just about to finish college, and had always been a bit distant from Maria. It wasn't that he disliked her, it was just that he never seemed to truly embrace her as part of his life. He had his own circle of friends, his own routine, and the last thing he wanted was to be constantly involved in his father's new marriage. At first, Maria tried to respect his boundaries, giving him space to adjust to the changes in his father's life. But deep down, she yearned for a closer connection with him. She knew that in a blended family, this connection was important, perhaps even essential, for harmony to exist. But over the past few months, things hadn't progressed as she had hoped. Whenever Jack and Maria spent time together, Ethan would retreat to his room or make excuses to leave the house. Maria didn't take it personally. She knew. It wasn't easy being the new person in someone's life, but she couldn't help but feel that something was missing in the relationship. She wanted to bridge that gap, to find a way to bring Ethan into the fold, to make him feel like he was part of their new family. That Saturday, however, Maria was feeling more hopeful than usual. Jack had been invited to a business conference out of town, and it was the first weekend in months that he and Ethan would be alone together. Jack had insisted Maria join him on the trip, but she decided to stay behind. She thought it might be a good opportunity to spend some time with Ethan, just the two of them. Maybe they would go out for lunch, or just hang out and talk. She had noticed a slight shift in Ethan's behavior lately. A few more words, exchanged at dinner, a momentary smile when she asked about his day. It wasn't much, but it was a start. So when Jack left early that morning, Maria and Ethan were left to their own devices. The air was lighter, the house quieter, and there was a sense of anticipation that neither of them had expected. At first, everything seemed fine. They decided to watch a movie together, a light comedy that had both of them laughing. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long while, they were spending time together, without the awkwardness that had defined their relationship before. As they sat there in the living room, their laughter filled the space, and Maria couldn't help but feel a warm sense of contentment. It was a simple moment, nothing extraordinary, but it felt good. It felt right. But then something shifted. The laughter faded as the movie ended, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. There was a stillness in the air, a subtle tension that neither Maria nor Ethan could ignore. Maria could feel the distance between them closing, but she wasn't sure if it was a good thing. Her heart raced slightly as she stole a glance at Ethan. He was looking at her differently now, his gaze more intent, less detached. She couldn't place it, but there was something about the way he was looking at her that made her feel exposed. Vulnerable even? It wasn't a look of affection, at least not the kind that was easy to define, but something else, something deeper. As the minutes passed, the small moments of silence grew heavier. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Maria tried to find something to say to fill the void. But her words felt inadequate. She wasn't sure if she was imagining things, but there was a magnetic pull between them now, a sense of closeness that made her heart pound. Then, as if it was meant to happen, their conversation shifted in tone. They began to talk more openly about their lives, about Ethan's future, his dreams after graduation, and Maria's own experiences. They shared stories of growing up, of moments in their past that had shaped them. For a brief moment, it felt like they were more than just stepmother and stepson. They were two people who, despite the boundaries, could connect on a human level. But as they continued to talk, something unexpected began to happen. The distance between them seemed to evaporate. There was an unspoken understanding in the way they looked at each other, something that neither of them had anticipated. Maria could feel the warmth in Ethan's gaze, and it stirred something inside her. It was confusing. These emotions that seemed to rise without warning, without explanation. Her breath caught in her chest. Was this the connection she had been hoping for? Was this the bond that had been missing in their relationship all along? But then, just as quickly as the thought appeared, another part of her kicked in. This wasn't right. She was married to Jack. Ethan was his son. No matter how deep their conversation had become, no matter how much they seemed to connect, there were lines that couldn't be crossed. Maria knew that. She had to remind herself of that. Still, the moment lingered. Ethan was close. So close that she could feel the heat of his presence next to her. She could hear his soft breathing, and for a second, their eyes met with an intensity that made her pulse race. This wasn't just a family moment anymore. It felt like something else entirely, something forbidden, something dangerous. That's when it happened. The door slammed open, and the sound of Jack's voice cut through the silence like a sharp knife. "I'm home," he called, and just like that, the spell was broken. The closeness evaporated as quickly as it had come. Maria felt a rush of relief mixed with guilt. Ethan stood up abruptly, and Maria quickly turned away, trying to regain her composure. They had almost crossed a line, and in that split second, she realized how fragile everything was, how easily it could all come undone. But the question remained, what had just happened? Why did it feel so real? What had they almost done? And what would it mean for the family they were trying to build? The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The sound of Jack's departure still echoed in Maria's mind, but it was quickly replaced by a strange stillness. After the laughter of the movie had died down, both Maria and Ethan sat in silence, unsure of what to do next. Maria had hoped for some easy conversation with her stepson, but now it felt as if something had shifted between them, something neither of them could put into words. The air felt charged, thick with an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore. It was almost as if they were seeing each other in a new light. At first, Maria tried to brush it off. She didn't want to read too much into the awkwardness that had crept into their conversation. It wasn't the first time things had felt strange between them. After all, they were still adjusting to living under the same roof. But today was different. She couldn't deny the subtle pull she felt toward Ethan. There was something about him today that was different. His usual aloofness had softened. Instead of retreating into his room, he had stayed in the living room, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely engaged. His eyes weren't darting around the room, avoiding hers. No, today they held her gaze. And that gaze, it was unsettling, yet familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Ethan shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. He was looking at her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. There was no more hiding behind his usual teenage indifference. Instead, he seemed to be taking her in, really looking at her as if trying to understand her in a way he hadn't before. It was almost as though the walls between them were coming down, bit by bit, and Maria wasn't sure how to handle it. She wanted to speak, to bridge the gap with casual conversation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself studying him, really studying him. Ethan was no longer the boy she had barely spoken to. He was becoming something else in her eyes, and that frightened her. She tried to shift her focus, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything about this moment was leading to something bigger than either of them were prepared for. Finally, it was Ethan who spoke, his voice breaking through the tension. "I've been thinking about what you said, about trying to get closer," he said quietly, his eyes still locked on hers. His tone was casual, but there was a depth to it, an openness that felt unfamiliar, even vulnerable. Maria was taken aback. Had she really said that? She had been trying so hard to be respectful of Ethan's space that she hadn't realized he'd been paying attention to. Her attempts to connect with him. She hadn't expected him to bring it up. "Yeah," she replied, her voice softer than usual, unsure of how to respond. "I know it's been hard. For both of us. I just thought maybe we could start with something simple. You know, just getting to know each other a bit more." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. It's not easy to just suddenly become a family, right? It feels like there's this distance we can't get past." Maria smiled faintly, relieved that Ethan was at least acknowledging the awkwardness between them. "Exactly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're still figuring it out. But it's important, Ethan. I want us to be able to talk, to connect, even if it takes time." Ethan was silent for a moment, his eyes dropping to his hands. which were clasped tightly in his lap. Maria could sense that he was deep in thought. And then, almost as if he had made a decision, he turned back to face her, his gaze steady. "You know, I've always had a hard time with this, with having you in my life. I didn't want to let anyone in after everything with my mom." Maria's heart ached at his words. She could hear the pain in his voice, and suddenly it all made sense. Ethan wasn't just pushing her away because of her. He was grieving the loss of his mother, grieving the broken pieces of his family that he wasn't ready to accept. Jack's divorce, her marriage to Jack, the blending of two separate lives. It must have felt like an overwhelming weight for him to carry alone. "I know it must be hard for you, Ethan," Maria said softly, her voice laced with understanding. "I can't replace your mom, and I'm not trying to. But I want you to know that I'm here, if you ever need someone to talk to." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment, but his eyes softened as he looked at her. For a brief second, Maria thought she saw the faintest flicker of emotion, perhaps something close to gratitude or acknowledgement. But then, as if to protect himself, he quickly looked away. "It's fine," he muttered, the walls coming up again. "I'm not really used to talking about stuff like that." Maria felt a pang of frustration, but she understood. Ethan wasn't ready, and she couldn't force him to be. Still, something was different now. The space between them had shifted. There was an openness in the air that hadn't been there before. Maria wasn't sure what it meant, but it felt significant. To break the silence, Maria smiled gently. "You're still my stepson, whether you like it or not," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan chuckled softly, his posture relaxing a little. "Yeah, I know, but it's still weird. I'm not asking you to change everything overnight," Maria said, her tone more serious. "But I do want us to have a relationship, whatever that looks like, even if it's just talking about movies and random stuff for now." Ethan met her gaze again, his eyes warmer this time, more open. "I can do that," he said, a small but genuine smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Movies and random stuff, I think I can manage that." They both chuckled, the tension easing slightly. But Maria knew that beneath their casual conversation, something had shifted. There was an undeniable connection growing between them. A closeness that neither of them had expected. And yet, as much as Maria wanted to embrace this newfound connection, something inside her hesitated. This bond, this sense of familiarity was dangerous. It felt like it was pulling her in too deep, and she wasn't sure how far she was willing to go. Ethan stood up slowly, moving toward the kitchen as he changed the subject. "Want to grab something to eat?" he asked casually, clearly trying to move past the heavy conversation. "Sure," Maria replied, still caught in the whirlwind of emotions that had just surfaced. "Let's eat." As they moved into the kitchen, the air felt lighter again. But in the back of Maria's mind, the question lingered: what was happening between them? And more importantly, where would this connection lead? Maria knew she had to tread carefully. Her new family was fragile, and every choice she made from here on out would have lasting consequences. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting soft, golden rays through the kitchen window. It had been a strange, almost surreal day, one full of emotions neither Maria nor Ethan had fully processed. As the evening approached, the last traces of the awkwardness between them seemed to fade. They'd spent the rest of the afternoon chatting casually, sharing stories, and even laughing about trivial things that felt like old friends would do. But beneath the lighthearted conversations, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. It wasn't just that Maria was beginning to feel closer to Ethan, it was that the distance between them seemed to have vanished entirely. She could sense it in the way their interactions had shifted, in the small moments of eye contact that lingered a little too long, the quiet smiles that weren't just polite but meaningful. For the first time since Jack's return, she felt a rising tension inside her, a pull that had nothing to do with family connection, but something deeper, more unsettling. They were sitting in the living room again, this time with the TV off. As the evening air had cooled the house to a comfortable temperature, Maria sat on the couch, close to the armrest, while Ethan sat on the chair just across from her. The space between them had always been a comforting boundary. At least, it used to be. Now, it felt like it was closing in on her. She could feel his presence beside her, the warmth of his body just out of reach, yet so tangible that it sent an unfamiliar shiver down her spine. It was only when Ethan broke the silence that Maria felt the weight of the moment fully settle in. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes focused intensely on her face. Maria's heart skipped a beat. "Maria," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost like a whisper. The sound of her name on his lips felt heavier than it ever had before. She turned toward him slowly, unsure of where this was going. There had been moments today where she felt the line between them blur, where the connection was undeniable. But in that moment, the line was no longer there. Ethan leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze still fixed on her. I need to tell you something," he said, his words carrying a weight that Maria couldn't quite place. Maria's breath hitched. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. What was he going to say? For a brief moment, she thought about how she should respond, how she could steer the conversation away from whatever was building between them. She should tell him that they were family, that boundaries needed to be respected. But before she could speak, Ethan continued, his voice full of something Maria hadn't expected. Uncertainty, but also something else, something vulnerable. "I've been thinking a lot about today," he said, his words slow, deliberate, "and about everything I said earlier, about trying to connect, trying to make this work. But there's something I need to tell you, something I can't keep inside anymore." Maria's heart pounded. This wasn't just about building a family anymore. This was about something deeper, something that was about to change everything between them. Before Maria could respond, Ethan's gaze shifted slightly. He looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting nervously, almost as if he were trying to gather the courage to say the words. The silence between them stretched out, filled with unspoken tension, before Ethan's eyes found hers again. "Maria, I don't know how to say this, but I think I've been feeling something that I shouldn't be feeling." Maria's stomach dropped. No, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. This isn't right. Her mind screamed at her to stop him, to pull back, to remind him of the boundaries they had both agreed on. This wasn't a situation that could be ignored. This was something deeper, something dangerous that could unravel everything she had worked for with Jack. But even as the warning bells rang inside her, she couldn't seem to move. Her body felt frozen, her heart racing out of control. Ethan's voice grew softer, his words more tentative. "I know I shouldn't be feeling this way. You're married to my dad. You're family now. But I can't help it. I don't know what it is. It's like there's this pull I can't ignore. And I don't want to make this weird. I need to say it, even if it doesn't make sense." Maria's breath caught in her throat. No. This couldn't be happening. Her mind was spiraling, grappling with the overwhelming wave of emotions that had come rushing forward, all of them in a tangled mess of confusion, guilt, and fear. The sudden realization of what was happening between them hit her like a wave. This wasn't a connection of family bonding. It was something else, entirely, a dangerous attraction that threatened to tear everything apart. For the longest time, neither of them spoke. The words were out there, hanging between them like a heavy fog, suffocating in its intensity. Maria could feel the weight of the moment crushing her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, to make this stop, to fix the situation before it spiraled further out of control. But nothing came. Ethan was staring at her now, his eyes full of uncertainty, waiting for her reaction. Maria's mind raced, her emotions clashing. She knew she couldn't let this go any further. She couldn't let herself fall into this, whatever it was. She couldn't let him think that what he was feeling was okay. She couldn't risk destroying her relationship with Jack, or the fragile bond she had been working so hard to build. Her voice finally broke the silence, though it was trembling. "Ethan," she began, her words coming out more slowly than she intended. "What you're feeling, it's not wrong, but it's not right either. We can't cross that line. We're family, and no matter what happens between us, we have to respect that." The words felt like they were tearing at her, but Maria knew they were the only words that could save them both from a path that could destroy everything. She couldn't let this moment define their relationship, and she couldn't let it destroy her marriage with Jack. Ethan sat back in his chair, his expression falling. The light in his eyes dimmed as the reality of the situation sank in. "I didn't mean to make things difficult," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I just didn't know what to do with how I felt." Maria swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had to stay strong for both of them. "It's okay, Ethan, but we need to set boundaries. We need to remember that we're family now, and that's the most important thing. What happened today, what you felt, it can't happen again. We have to respect each other and respect the boundaries we've set." Ethan nodded, though his face was tight with emotion. The moment had passed, but the weight of it would linger. For both of them, the sense of connection they had shared would never be the same. It wasn't the way Maria had envisioned getting closer to her stepson, but now it was clear that they would have to move forward, carefully and cautiously, knowing that the distance between them was still necessary to keep their family intact. The night fell quiet, but inside Maria's mind, the storm of emotions raged on. She sat in the same chair, but everything felt different now. The earlier laughter, the casual moments they shared, seemed like a distant memory compared to the heaviness that lingered in the air. She glanced over at Ethan, who had retreated to his room after their conversation, his footsteps echoing softly down the hallway. Even though the tension had broken, the aftermath of what they had just gone through was hard to ignore. There were no easy answers here, no quick fix that could restore everything to normal. What had just happened would forever change the dynamics of their relationship, and Maria knew that she couldn't simply pretend like it hadn't occurred. In that brief moment of honesty between her and Ethan, something had shifted irrevocably. What had started as an awkward attempt to bond had transformed into a confrontation of something deeper, something raw and complicated that neither of them had anticipated. But even in the midst of this emotional whirlwind, Maria could see the bigger picture. The boundaries she had set with Ethan were not just to protect their family, but to protect them both from the risks of crossing into dangerous territory. As much as it had hurt to let go of the emotional connection, she had felt growing between them. Maria knew it was the right thing to do. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for Jack, who would never understand what had nearly happened, and for Ethan, who was still grieving the pieces of his broken family. What they had nearly crossed into wasn't just a boundary of family. It was one of respect, of decency, and of love for the family they had both been trying to build. She couldn't risk destroying that, no matter how difficult it was to keep the emotional distance between them. Maria looked out the window, the stars flickering softly in the dark sky. Her thoughts drifted to Jack, who would be home soon, unaware of the emotional chaos that had unfolded in his absence. She had to be careful. She had to protect her marriage, protect her family. Ethan's feelings were valid, yes, but the priority now was ensuring that their family stayed intact, that the connection they had worked so hard to build wasn't shattered by a momentary lapse in judgment. As Maria sat alone in the quiet, she couldn't help but reflect on the deeper lessons that had emerged from the day. The notion of boundaries, respect, and family connection were all things she had taken for granted before. But today, they had come to the forefront of her mind in a way that felt almost like a wake-up call. It wasn't just about fitting into a new family. It was about knowing where each person stood and understanding the fragility of the bonds they were trying to form. Maria had learned, perhaps the hard way, that the line between family closeness and something more was razor thin. Once crossed, it could be impossible to return to the way things were. She glanced at her phone, waiting for Jack's text to say he was on his way home. She knew that tomorrow, life would continue as usual. They would all move forward, trying to rebuild the harmony they had lost for a moment. But Maria knew something had irrevocably changed in her. She could no longer take for granted the importance of emotional boundaries. She could no longer pretend that everything in their blended family would just fall into place. It was going to take work, patience, and careful attention to ensure that they stayed on track. Maria understood now that family wasn't about forcing connections. It was about respecting the space between individuals, allowing time for natural relationships to develop. She also understood that love, in all its forms, required boundaries, whether it was romantic love, familial love, or self-love. Without boundaries, without respect, the fragile threads holding them together would unravel. But with them, there was hope for a future where all of them could coexist in harmony. As Maria stood up and made her way to the kitchen, she found herself silently praying for the strength to keep moving forward. She had to be patient with herself, with Ethan, and with Jack. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could choose to learn from it, to become more aware of the delicate balance between love, respect, and family. In the end, Maria knew the truth. She couldn't erase the past, but she could shape the future. The path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations, uncomfortable silences, and moments of doubt. But with time and effort, she believed they could find their way back to a place where they all felt safe, respected, and loved. And as Jack's car pulled into the driveway, Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. Tomorrow would be a new day, one full of possibilities, and she was determined to face it with strength, clarity, and the unwavering belief that they could still make their blended family work.